Hello there, this is Matthew, N3AZ. I wanted to follow up the last video. In our last video, we went over the repair of my Astron RS 35M power supply, specifically the replacement of two bridge rectifiers that their tech support was kind enough to send to me for repair. I didn't want to have to ship it in, because shipping on something this heavy would add up to quite a bit. So I decided to replace them myself. Took me a couple of years sitting on my bench here until I finally got around to it. But I wanted to go over what exactly was involved in fixing this thing. So first, I had to desolder these three wires from this pair of bridge rectifiers. And to do that, I used this Hakko desoldering iron. One of these guys, the FR301. And what this does, it's as good as a Hakko soldering iron, only it has a little hole in the middle and a trigger, and it will actually suck the molten solder into this chamber here as you're working. So you don't have to mess around with solder wicks, solder sucking bulbs, all those kind of things. And frankly, this works much better. Now, you pay for that privilege. It's not exactly the cheapest piece of equipment, but I find it very handy for desoldering components from boards and in general getting solder out of your way. So I got most of the solder out, enough to untwist these wires. I'm going to zoom back in here. See those three wires here, this one, and this one, they're actually wrapped around these three bars. These three bars connect the actual bridge rectifiers together to make them one. See, they start out separate, and then they have these little bars to kind of connect them and to parallel them together. And so the first thing I had to do was remove this whole unit with these bolts, just using a socket set or something like this to get down in there, take off the little nut, and then there's a bolt on the other side that goes all the way through the case. And so I kind of removed it to get it more accessible. Then I had to desolder, get as much of the solder gone, untwist it. In the end, I ended up just clipping it, the actual wire infused with solder, because you just can't get all that solder out of there. So I ended up clipping it off. So these wires are now about a ½ centimeter shorter each than they were when they started. Hopefully I won't have to change these bridge rectifiers anytime soon. So first step, it took about an hour, was getting these old bridge rectifiers out, desoldering these wires from the bars, and then I had to actually remove the three bars because I needed them for the new ones. I didn't want to just replace it with some random wire. I probably could have come up with some little bar like that, but I figured the ones that came with it are probably the best. So I desoldered that, and then, of course, the hard part was getting the two bridge rectifiers in the exact same position so that these two holes would line up, because you don't want them to not fit or have them just be over a little bit and now you can't get the things back in there. So I lined them up on top of each other. I was just, trying this and that. And, of course, I marked the side with the word out, so I knew which side was facing out and which side was facing the transformer. Little tricks like that. And so the second step was to fuse or to connect the two new bridge rectifiers in essentially the same configuration that the original ones were in. And then once that was done, it was time to connect these wires. So again, I had to clip off the exposed wire that was infused with solder because it was too stiff. I couldn't work with it. So then I restripped the wire, and then, of course, I had to solder these wires to these essentially heat sinks. And as anyone who's soldered will tell you, soldering a resistor or a capacitor or a transistor onto a circuit board, that's easy compared to doing anything involving large chunks of metal. And so I turned up the Hakko soldering iron over there to about 990 Fahrenheit to really give it some oomph. Because of course I have to get the actual, what I call the bars, these 3 pieces of metal, I had to get those hot enough to melt solder so it would actually form a good solder joint. Because otherwise this thing would just go back and forth, slide up and down the bar. It wouldn't make good contact, and that would be a disaster. So I finally got those 3 solidly connected to the 3 wires, and then I just had to put this thing down in there, and it took a little more time to get to put the screw through the bottom and then come at it from the top with this thing. Of course, it's not magnetized, so you have to put that little nut on there just so, and then twist it. All in all, if this happened again, I'd be very tempted to ship it back to them. I don't know how much it would be, 60 or 70 bucks shipping, but I mean, for how it was, I wouldn't say it wasn't such a big deal that it deserved to sit on my bench for 2 years, but I also wouldn't say it was drop dead easy. I mean, I'm glad I did it. It's very satisfying to know that I can do it, but it was a bit of work, and it definitely was a bit of a challenge. So take that for what it's worth. And so I think that's about it. I already showed all of the tools that I used for this project. The only one I neglected to mention was my fancy Heiko FR301 here. This really was invaluable for getting the majority of the solder off of the original bridge rectifiers. And of course I had to use all these standard tools. I used a Sharpie to mark the wires. I mean, I used a screwdriver to scrape some of the molten solder off the bottom of the case there when I dripped a little bit. And here's the silicone paste I had to apply. When I put the 2 bridge rectifiers back, of course I had to carefully apply some of this to the bottom of each one, and then put it down on the case without too much delay, so that it didn't get all over the place. So yeah, it took a little bit of care and a little bit of work, but in the end, it's fixed. So that's it for part 2.